Alright, welcome back to Chapter 8, Pathophysiology. I hope that we don't have another mishap like we did in Chapter 7 and have to recap a new section, but trial and error, we'll see. Our overview will be cellular metabolism and the components necessary for adequate perfusion. Our case study introduction: EMTs Patty Mirabel and Gus Oakes are on the scene of a 52-year-old man who is complaining of difficulty breathing. The patient is breathing shallowly and rapidly. He gasps, need, help, can't breathe. What purposes does breathing serve? And in what ways does a problem with breathing affect the body? As always, I encourage you to pause and write these questions down, because we're going to continue to move forward so that you can answer them later on or as we go with this lesson. Introduction: the oxygen and glucose are necessary for normal cell function. Illnesses and injuries can disturb the delivery of oxygen and glucose and removal of waste byproducts. A fundamental purpose of emergency care is maintaining adequate delivery of oxygen and glucose. Cellular metabolism. Cellular metabolism is the process in which the body breaks down molecules of glucose to produce energy. What I talked about earlier in Chapter 7, when we talked about aerobic metabolism. This takes place when oxygen is available. When there is a lack of oxygen, the body uses a less effective process called anaerobic. Remember, I told you aerobic was good and anaerobic is bad. Aerobic metabolism, the initial steps of cellular metabolism, do not require oxygen but produce only small amounts of energy. Oxygen is required to complete the process of extracting energy from glucose and removing the waste products, the waste produced by the process. Now we're thinking at the cellular level, really tiny here, okay? Just think about how something so tiny can affect the body in a great manner, okay? So here we go. Here's a cell and aerobic metabolism. Glucose broken down in the presence of oxygen produces a large amount of energy, or ATP. So we see figure A here. Glucose. This is aerobic metabolism. This is the proper cellular metabolism. Glucose enters the cell. Oxygen enters the cell. And this produces ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, or energy. The initial steps of cell metabolism take place in the cytosol and are called glycolysis. Glycolysis produces a small amount of ATP. Then the process continues in the mitochondria, where larger amounts of ATP are produced. Byproducts of aerobic metabolism include heat, carbon dioxide, and water. The majority of ATP is used by the sodium-potassium pump, and we'll cover that more as well. A little bit quicker than I thought, but there we go. Okay, energy. ATP is required to pump sodium molecules out of the cell against the concentration gradient. So here we're talking about the sodium-potassium pump. We look at figure A. We have the intracellular fluid. We're in the cell down here. And this is, in A positive, is sodium. Okay, if you didn't know that. And this is the cell gateway. All right. That sodium enters that gateway. ATP pushes that lever on that cell, on that gate opening. It's open here, but it pushes it and it closes it over here, and then allows the sodium out into the extracellular fluid. In figure D, at that point, it's allowing potassium to enter the body, to enter the cell gateway. And once it's entered the cell gateway, the ADP is opened and the potassium enters into the cell. Let's go over that again. Sodium leaves the cell through the gateway. ATP opens the gateway by opening the ADP, allowing the sodium to leave, At that point, the potassium enters the gateway, the ADP closes and opens the other side and lets the potassium into the cell. There we go. Sodium potassium pump. Very, very, very microscopic. All right, byproducts of aerobic metabolism include heat, carbon dioxide, and water, and the majority of ATP is used by the sodium potassium pump. If the pump fails, the cell will die. So sodium and potassium are important for our cells to function properly. If it fails, we die. Anaerobic metabolism. The first stage of cell metabolism is anaerobic. The waste product produced is pyruvic acid. Without oxygen, pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. Accumulation of lactic acid is harmful to the body functions. Sodium potassium pump failure. In anaerobic metabolism, the combination of inadequate energy production and accumulation of lactic acid results in failure of the cell processes. An animated view of the anaerobic metabolism. Glucose broken down without the presence of oxygen produces pyruvic acid. That converts to lactic acid, and only a small amount of energy is produced. So glucose enters the cell, no oxygen. Pyruvic acid is produced, or lactic acid turned into lactic acid. A little bit of ATP, but not quite the amount we're looking for. All right, we talked about that word perfusion. Talked about perfusion in Chapter 7. Perfusion is the delivery of oxygen, glucose, and other substances to the cell and the elimination of waste products from the cells. Requires interaction of multiple components. And those components are the composition of ambient air, the air that you're breathing. The patency of the airway, that means how well the airway is open and clear. Mechanics of ventilation, are your lungs and your chest cavity operating properly to allow enough tidal volume and oxygen? Ventilation/perfusion ratio, the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. Blood volume, pump function and of the myocardium. The myocardium is the heart. Systemic vascular resistance, and microcirculation and blood pressure. Here are the components necessary for adequate perfusion. Any alteration in the components may lead to poor cellular perfusion. Inadequate perfusion can shift cells from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. Emergency care focuses on restoring and maintaining those components. Back to the case study. Gus quickly moves next to the patient to better assess his condition, while Patty unzips the airway kit and begins to select equipment to begin patient care. What specifically will Gus be assessing to determine the patient's condition? How will Patty know what equipment and treatment the patient needs? What is happening to the patient at the cellular level? And what will happen if the EMTs do not intervene quickly? Again, pause and write these questions down. Composition of ambient air. The concentration of oxygen in the ambient air influences oxygen that ends up in the alveoli for gas exchange. Ambient air contains approximately 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, and trace amounts of argon and carbon dioxide. I told you in Chapter 7 we breathe in 21% of oxygen and 79% nitrogen. And here's a table to show you partial pressures of gases in the ambient atmosphere at sea level. The gas on the left, oxygen, 20.95%. Partial pressure is 159.2 millimeters of mercury. Nitrogen, 78.8, 593.4 millimeters of mercury. Argon, 0.93 or 7.1 millimeters of mercury, and carbon dioxide 0.03 or 0.2 millimeters of mercury. And blank is 99.99%. That is not relevant. Okay, so oxygen, nitrogen, argon, and carbon dioxide is what we breathe in, and those are the percentages. All right, the FiO2 is the fraction of inspired oxygen. FiO2 is the fraction of delivered oxygen, which if you look at the way it's set up, the mnemonic is Fi, fraction of inspired, Fi, fraction of inspired oxygen, and then FD, fraction of delivered O2, fraction of delivered oxygen. One way to improve cellular oxygenation is to provide supplemental oxygen. So let's go back. Let's see what the notes say here. I want you to better understand FiO2 and FdO2. Let me maximize the screen. Okay, increasing the concentration of oxygen in breathed air increases the number of oxygen molecules in the alveoli, the blood, and the cells. Thus, one way to improve cellular oxygenation is by increasing the concentration of oxygen in the air breathed by the patient. A patient breathing ambient air that contains 21% oxygen would have an FiO2 of 0.21. A non-rebreather mask can deliver an FiO2 of approximately 0.95, which is an oxygen concentration of approximately 95%. An FiO2 of 1.0 would be equal to the inspiration of 100% oxygen concentration. An FdO2 is a fraction of oxygen delivered. The difference between an FiO2 and an FdO2 is that the FiO2 is administered to a patient who is breathing spontaneously and inhaling the air on his own effort. That means autonomic. Whereas the FdO2 is delivered by ventilation device to a patient who is not able to breathe adequately on his own. Some toxic gases displace the amount of oxygen in the air, which suffocates the patient. Carbon monoxide disrupts the ability of the blood to carry oxygen to the cells. Cyanide interferes with the oxygen used by the cells. Each of these situations leads to hypoxia. Okay. So, in a review, FiO2 is we can increase the patient's oxygen levels if they are breathing 21%. We can give them supplemental oxygen if they're breathing on their own, and they could get up to 100% oxygen in their alveoli. This is FiO2. They're inspiring it on their own. FdO2, the delivered oxygen, we can deliver this by positive pressure ventilation or CPAP or BiPAP or anything like that. Okay. Patency of the airway. A patent airway is open and not obstructed by any substance. Open and not obstructed by any substance. Establishing an open airway is one of the first steps in emergency care. Failure to establish or maintain a patent airway leads to cellular hypoxia and patient death. Sorry about that again. Locations of airway obstructions will be the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, epiglottis, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. Refer back to Chapter 7 for your anatomy. When you think about these different parts of the airway. I'm not going to review for you unless it does it myself. And there it is. I knew it was going to happen. Airway obstruction can occur at several levels of the upper and lower airway, including the naso, oro, posterior pharynx, epiglottis, larynx, trachea, and bronchi. And it's blown up some pictures for you, showing you an obstruction in the trachea, obstructions in the bronchi, a constricted bronchiole, nasopharynx obstruction, oropharynx, it can be stuck back here. All right. The mechanics of ventilation. An intact thoracic cavity is integral to normal ventilation. Boyle's law defines and illustrates how ventilation occurs in the body. And we're going to go over Boyle's law, Henry's law, all that stuff when we go over submersion. We're not going to spend too much time on it here. The pleural linings, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, the damage to one or both pleural linings can disrupt normal ventilation, even inflammation, like I talked about in last chapter, pleurisy, prior to the movement of air into the lungs on inhalation. Give you a few seconds to look at that. If you chose C, pressure within the chest decreases, you would be correct. Your answer is supported by two principles of physics. First, according to Boyle's law, the pressure of gas varies inversely with its volume. Second, air, a mixture of gases, moves from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. And I'm going to go back here and it's going to send me, there we go. All right, when the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, the thoracic cavity increases in volume, which lowers the pressure in the thorax and lungs, and air flows from the higher atmospheric pressures in the area of lower pressure within the lungs. Okay, let me make sure we are, okay, good. We don't want to jump around on this. All right, accessory muscles. They're used when extra effort is needed for inhalation or exhalation. Indication of a heightened, that should be heightened, not heighted, a heightened ventilatory effort, and then requires more energy. Accessory muscles of inhalation. The following accessory muscles of inhalation are used to increase the size of the thoracic cavity and generate a greater negative pressure, increasing the flow of air into the lungs. Sternocleidomastoid muscles lift the sternum upward. Scalene muscles elevate ribs 1 and 2. And pectoralis minor muscles elevate ribs 3 to 5. The abdominal muscles, this is during exhalation. This was during inhalation, this is during exhalation. Abdominal muscles contract and increase the pressure inside the abdominal cavity, forcing the diaphragm to move higher against the lungs. Intercostal muscles contract and pull the sternum and ribs downward. Airway compliance and resistance. High resistance and low compliance increase the effort needed to breathe and lead to hypoxia. Compliance disorders make it hard for the lung tissue to inflate. Resistance disorders result from constriction of small airways. The pleural space. Negative pressure is maintained in the pleural space or cavity. An injury to the chest wall or lung that opens the space can draw air by way of negative pressure into the space. The lung may collapse from air accumulation. Minute ventilation. The amount of air moved in and out of the lungs in 1 minute. Minute volume equals tidal volume times frequency of ventilation. To ensure adequate ventilation, both the tidal volume and respiratory rate must be adequate. A decrease in tidal volume decreases the minute volume. A decrease in respiratory rate decreases the minute volume. A decrease in minute volume reduces the air available for gas exchange in the alveoli. Alveolar ventilation, the amount of air moved in and out of the alveoli in 1 minute. Dead space air does not reach the alveoli during breathing. An average of 350 milliliters of a 500 milliliter tidal volume reaches the alveoli. So what they're saying is we should be taking in 500 milliliters of air on each breath, or 5 liters of air, but only 350 or 3.5 liters is reaching the alveoli. Everything else goes to dead space. Hypoxia can occur from a low tidal volume, a slow ventilatory rate, a fast ventilatory rate. Typically, pulmonary illnesses and trauma affect the tidal volume more significantly. Regulation of ventilation. Breathing is an involuntary process controlled by the ANS, Autonomic Nervous System. Receptors measure oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions. Receptors send signals to the brain to adjust the rate and depth of respiration. Chemoreceptors are central and peripheral. In the peripheral, you have the hypercapnic drive and the hypoxic drive. COPD patients have a tendency to retain CO2, or carbon dioxide. They become insensitive to small changes in carbon dioxide. Their respirations are controlled by decreased oxygen levels. This is called the hypoxic drive. Respiration, controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Receptors within the body measure oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions and send signals to the brain to adjust the rate and depth of respiration. So if we look here at the figure, we have voluntary and higher centers right here, the pneumotaxic center, central chemoreceptors, and if we look, this is all coming from the brain area here. The apneustic center, ventral respiratory group, and dorsal respiratory group. And then you see that all these nerves, A, B, C, D, and E, and where they connect to, how they respond to the spinal cord and to the body to control respiration. Lung receptors. 3 types of receptors within the lungs provide impulses to help regulate respiration. Irritant receptors, stretch receptors, and J receptors. Let's go back real quick. And there we go. Irritant receptors are found in the airways. They're sensitive to irritant gases, aerosols, and particles. Simulate coughing, bronchoconstriction, and increased ventilatory rate. Stretch receptors found in the smooth muscle of the airways and protect against overinflation of the lungs. And J receptors are found in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, sensitive to increases in capillaries, and when activated, they stimulate rapid and shallow breathing. Respiratory centers in the brainstem: the ventral respiratory group, the dorsal respiratory group, and the pontine respiratory group. Let's see if we got some notes on those. The ventral respiratory group is located in the medulla oblongata, receives sensory input and sends it to the spinal cord to stimulate the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. It contains inspiratory and expiratory neurons, controls basic patterns of breathing. Dorsal respiratory group located in the medulla oblongata and receives sensory input and communication into the VRG for further input on rate and depth of breathing. And then the pontine respiratory center sends inhibitory impulses to the inspiratory neurons of the VRG to turn off the inhalation. Promotes a smooth transition between inhalation and exhalation. Okay. Back to the case study. The patient is working hard to breathe and has pale, moist skin. He is using accessory muscles to breathe but seems to be moving very little air. The patient appears sleepy as if on the verge of exhaustion. Patty selects a bag mask device to assist the patient's ventilation and connects it to supplemental oxygen. What medical problems could lead a patient to have such a severe difficulty of breathing? All right, components necessary for adequate perfusion. Ventilation/perfusion ratio. VQ ratio is the relationship between alveolar ventilation and perfusion of the alveolar capillaries. The relationship influences gas exchange, can be used to explain causes of hypoxemia. Here's an overview. We have the pulmonary circuit here, the systemic circuit. Blown up, you see the alveolus. CO2 and O2 is changing in the capillary, just like we had talked about. And then down at the cellular level, we see the body cells giving off that CO2 and accepting that oxygen from oxygenated blood. In an ideal state, the amount of ventilation is equally matched to the amount of perfusion. However, a perfect match does not actually occur. Overall perfusion exceeds ventilation, but the situation is highly functional. When ventilation is better than perfusion, there is wasted ventilation. When perfusion is better than ventilation, there is wasted perfusion. All right, some possible causes of ventilation disturbances. We have our airway here. Over here we have the venous blood and the arterial blood. If we see air going down to the alveolus, it's good. Everything's copacetic here, circulating. But we go over here and we have a blockage. Well, we don't get any oxygen down to this alveolus, and deoxygenated blood, or no oxygenated blood returns to the heart. Or if we do not have a blockage and air gets to the alveolus, but we have a blockage in the vein, then we can't have oxygenated blood return to the heart. So perfusion without ventilation, so no air, but perfusion. And then ventilation without perfusion, so we have air coming in, but no perfusion, because it's blocking the oxygen-gas exchange. Pressure imbalance. If the air pressure in the alveolus exceeds the blood pressure in the capillary bed, blood flow through the capillary stops, pinches it off. It occurs normally in the apex of the lungs. Occurs when the systemic blood pressure decreases. Ventilatory disturbances, a condition that decreases the amount of air reaching the alveoli, such as asthma, results in wasted perfusion. Hypoxemia and hypoxia result. Treatment is aimed at increasing lung ventilation. Perfusion disturbances. Ventilation is normal or even increased, but blood flow through the lungs is decreased. There is wasted ventilation leading to hypoxemia and hypoxia. Hypoxemia is low oxygen levels in the blood, and hypoxia is low oxygen, period, in the lungs, period, throughout the body. Administering oxygen may help, but the perfusion disturbance must be corrected. So you can give oxygen all you want, but if there's a blockage in oxygen getting to the blood, well, you can pump as much oxygen as you want, but it's just not going to get to the blood, so it's going to stop that oxygen being delivered to the cells. The transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. Oxygen must be continuously delivered by the blood to the cells. Carbon dioxide must be carried back to the lungs to be blown off in exhalation. A disturbance in the transport system may lead to cellular hypoxia or hypercarbia. Hypercarbia is too much carbon dioxide in the body. Gases move from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. So we see the gas exchange at the lungs, O2 transport, 97% is attached to hemoglobin, goes to the tissues, and then the tissues give off that CO2 back to the lungs to get oxygenated. Red blood cells with hemoglobin, and then which is 97%, and 3% is dissolved in the plasma. Oxygen transport. O2 is transported in the blood in two ways. 1.5 to 3% is dissolved in plasma. 97 to 98.5% is attached to hemoglobin molecules. The role of the hemoglobin is a protein molecule that contains iron. There are 4 iron sites per hemoglobin. So it will take on 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide transported in the blood 3 ways. 7% is dissolved in plasma. 23% is attached to hemoglobin in RBCs. 70% is transported by the lungs in the form of bicarbonate. So we see attached to hemoglobin and dissolved in plasma, carbon dioxide is transported in the blood 3 ways as bicarbonate, attached to hemoglobin and dissolved in plasma. So that gives you the breakdown, again, of the gas exchange. Alveolar capillary gas exchange. After inhalation, the alveolar air is high in O2 and low in CO2. Venous blood in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. And what will happen is that high level of oxygen will be sent into the blood to be oxygenated and brought back to the heart to get to the rest of the body. Alright, click on the mechanism by which most of the oxygen in the blood is transported. Most of the oxygen in the blood is transported where? If you chose bound to hemoglobin, you are correct. The loss of hemoglobin containing red blood cells, such as through hemorrhage, which is bleeding, is a loss of oxygen carrying capacity. Controlling bleeding is a critical way to help preserve a patient's ability to deliver oxygen to his cells. Blood volume. A determinant of blood pressure and perfusion is blood volume. Adults have 70 milliliters of blood per kilogram of body weight. 70 milliliters of blood per kilogram of body weight. Kilogram is 2.2 pounds, if you did not know that. A 70 kilogram adult has 4,900 milliliters or 4.9 liters of blood. 70 kilograms, if you want to do the math, your patient weighs 154 pounds. Okay, blood composition, 45% formed elements and 55% is plasma. If you didn't know this, you can go to the blood center and you can donate just plasma. It's kind of weird. I don't know how they separate it, but they do. Blood distribution, but the majority of the blood is in the venous system, but the minority of the blood is in the arterial system. All right, blood is distributed in the various components of the cardiovascular system as follows. Venous blood is 64%, arterial is 13%, pulmonary vessels 9%, capillary 7%, and 7% in the heart. Hydrostatic pressure is a force inside the vessel or capillary bed generated by the contraction of the heart and blood pressure. Hydrostatic pressure exerts a push inside the vessel or capillary. Plasma oncotic pressure keeps fluid inside the vessels to oppose hydrostatic pressure. Remember, hydrostatic pressure is pulling that plasma and water out. So you need that plasma oncotic pressure to keep it in. The large plasma proteins have the effect of pulling water into the capillaries. And there we go. Hydrostatic pressure here, pulling it out. Plasma oncotic pressure, keeping it in. Pump function of the myocardium. Myocardium must be an effective pump to maintain perfusion. Cardiac output is the amount of blood ejected from the heart in 1 minute. We will see the rate of that by checking a pulse. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Your heart rate is sympathetic and parasympathetic. Stroke volume is going to be the preload, how much is loaded into the ventricle before it's pumped. Contractility, how well the ventricle contracts. And then the afterload, how much is left after it's pumped through. All right. I love this picture because it's a very good illustration of preload, the effect of preload on stroke volume. So here we have normal preload right there, normal. That left ventricle is all full up, okay? Contracts, shows you the normal volume in this, and so it pumps it in there, okay? Pumping it to the body, filling it up. Cycles around. A reduced preload, okay? Reduced preload. See, it's not all filled up, pumps it out, don't quite get as much as we need to the volume, low volume here, okay? Not a good thing. All right, so we're looking at the difference. Reduced preload, normal preload. Then we have normal contractility, fills up that beaker. Reduced contractility, even though we have a full preload here, is going to still give us less volume, okay? Factors that increase cardiac output are increased heart rate to a point, increased blood volume, increased myocardial contractility, sympathetic nervous system stimulation, beta-1 stimulation from epinephrine. We remember that stimulation of beta-1 means one heart, beta-1, and a lower diastolic blood pressure. Decreased heart rate, factors that decrease cardiac output are decreased heart rate, decreased blood volume, decreased myocardial contractility, parasympathetic nervous system, beta-1 blockade or beta blockers. I personally take beta blockers. Higher diastolic blood pressure over time. Systemic vascular resistance is the resistance to blood flow through a vessel. Vasoconstriction increases systemic vascular resistance. Increased systemic vascular resistance increases blood pressure. Vasodilation decreases SVR, and decreased SVR decreases the blood pressure. All right, you see the effects of vasoconstriction and vasodilation on systemic vascular resistance. Over here we have vasoconstriction, decreased vessel size, increased systemic vascular resistance, because there's less room in there. There's normal, so you're going to have a normal SVR. Then the vasodilation, increased vessel size, decreased systemic vascular resistance because it's a lot bigger. And there's not a lot of pressure being put on the inside of the arterial wall. Pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure readings. The systolic blood pressure is a rough indicator of cardiac output, and diastolic blood pressure is a rough indicator of systemic vascular resistance. Microcirculation refers to the flow of blood through the arterioles, capillaries, and venules, because they're smaller. Microcirculation. Precapillary sphincters control the blood flow through the capillaries. See those little sphincters right there? Controlling that blood flow, okay? But they don't want to get it filled up too much because they can rupture. Regulatory influences on sphincters, the local factors, neural factors, and hormonal factors, depending on what our endocrine system is doing, what our brain is doing, and what's going on at the actual site of the capillaries. All right, blood pressure equals the cardiac output times the systemic vascular resistance. The relationship of SV and HR on cardiac output, an increased SV increases cardiac output, decreased SV decreases cardiac output, and increased heart rate increases cardiac output, and decreased heart rate decreases cardiac output. Increased cardiac output increases BP, the blood pressure. Decreased cardiac output decreases the blood pressure, and increased systemic vascular resistance increases the blood pressure, and decreased systemic vascular resistance decreases the blood pressure. The general effect of blood pressure on perfusion is increased blood pressure increases cellular perfusion, decreased blood pressure decreases cellular perfusion. The regulation of blood pressure by baroreceptors. Baroreceptors located in the aortic arch and carotid sinuses detect changes in blood pressure. Signals are sent to the vasomotor and cardioregulatory centers in the brain stem. Okay. Arterial baroreceptors are the little blue circles. Right there, right there. Signals sent to the brain. The brain sends the signals through the central nervous system back to the heart. The regulation of blood pressure by chemoreceptors. A decrease in blood oxygen level stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate increases and blood vessels constrict. Hypoxia can present with pale, cool skin and increased heart rate. Chemoreceptors in the aortic arch, the carotid arteries, sending signals to the medulla oblongata and pons, which then send signals to the lungs, increased respiratory rate and tidal volume. All right, review of aerobic metabolism components. 1. Oxygen content in ambient air. Patency of the airway. Minute ventilation is ventilatory rate and tidal volume. Alveolar ventilation is ventilatory rate and tidal volume. It includes those. Perfusion in the pulmonary capillaries. The venous volume right ventricular pump function, gas exchange between the capillaries and the alveoli, content of blood, red blood cells and hemoglobin, and plasma. Cardiac output and determinants: heart rate, preload, stroke volume, myocardial contractility, and afterload. Systemic vascular resistance, sympathetic nervous system stimulation, parasympathetic nervous system stimulation. Gas exchange between the capillaries and the cells. In our case study conclusion, the patient has a history of chronic obstructive lung disease and heart failure. He has been increasingly short of breath for 2 days with sudden worsening today. With the assistance of an engine crew, Patty and Gus continue assisting the patient's ventilations and providing supplemental oxygen. The crew recognizes the seriousness of the patient's condition and is prepared to take further measures, if needed, to maintain the patient's airway. Gus calls in a report to the receiving hospital. When they arrive at the emergency department, a physician, nurse, and respiratory therapist are waiting to continue the patient's care. Our lesson summary today: cells require oxygen and glucose to produce energy and perform work. Without adequate ventilation and perfusion, cells engage in anaerobic metabolism, which produces less energy and more waste. A fundamental purpose of emergency care is to restore and maintain cell perfusion. See you at Chapter 9.